Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Today my co-host Leroy Hill and I are joined by George Haraksin to offer a biblically sound and philosophically robust discussion of the Manifesto of the Communist Party by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. We'll explore how this treatise is behind many of today's biggest headlines, shaped the Western worldview, and maybe even deformed the worldview of many Christians. But before we dive in, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And remember, if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. Outside of some pop culture references, many of you are likely not familiar with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So let me kick things off by offering some useful background information. Karl Marx, best known for his development of the theory of communism, articulated in works like the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, was an influential philosopher, economist, historian, political theorist, sociologist, journalist, who was born on May 5th, 1818 in Trier, Prussia, which is now part of Germany. Marx was raised in a middle-class Jewish family and ostensibly forced to convert to Lutheranism due to the restrictive laws against Jews in Prussia. He studied law at the University of Bonn and later philosophy at the University of Berlin, where he was influenced by Hegelian philosophy. In his almost 7 decades of life, Marx experienced his share of hardship, in many cases self-inflicted. Marx lived a life of chronic debt and financial chaos, often borrowing money he couldn't repay, including from friends like Friedrich Engels, whose wealth, ironically, came from his family's industrial business. Marx also relied heavily on his wife, Jenny, for his financial support. In another bit of irony, Marx, the father of communism, refused to acknowledge that he fathered an illegitimate child through his maid. Marx, the defender of the poor and oppressed, cruelly abandoned his son to a life of poverty and hardship. As I think about Marx's life, his now famous maxim, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs," reads a lot like a philosophy of a blind narcissist who refused to face his failures as a man. Marx, to me, seems like a brilliant philosopher who invented an entire political system to shield himself from blame while holding everyone else in society responsible for his problems. Eventually, Marx died on March 14th, 1883 in London, England. As for Friedrich Engels, he was born on November 28, 1820, also in Prussia, and like Marx, was a philosopher, social scientist, and journalist. Engels was born into wealth and owed his financial security to his family's involvement in the textile industry. Engels' father was a Protestant, but Engels was inspired less by the Bible and more by his radical politics and the philosophy of Hegel. In 1842, after 1 year of Prussian military service, Engels' father sent him to Manchester, England, to work in the family textile firm, where Engels witnessed firsthand the harsh conditions of the industrial working class. This experience shaped Engels' social and economic views, leading to his seminal work, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845. Engels lived what I would generously call a morally carefree lifestyle and eventually died on August 5, 1895, in London. So how did Marx and Engels meet? Early in their intellectual development, both men were involved with a group known as the Young Hegelians, so it's no surprise that they had already read and admired each other's published works. Their first meeting was in 1842 in Cologne, but they did not begin their collaborative work until 1844, where they reunited in Paris. Their intellectual partnership has become one of the most significant in the history of political thought, as it laid the foundation for the modern practice of critical theory, socialism, and communism. Together, Marx and Engels published many works, including The Holy Family in 1845, The German Ideology in 1846, and the work we examine today, The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848. Finally, before we get into the show, I thought it'd be helpful to define a few key concepts. The communist ideal is driven by a materialist view of reality. First, there is a historical materialism, where the material condition of a society's mode of production fundamentally shapes its economic structure and consequently its social, political, and intellectual life. Historical materialism is defined by the class struggle between the oppressors and oppressed, especially between the proletariat or the working class and the bourgeois or the capitalist class. Historical materialism is also marked by alienation, which is the idea that under capitalism, workers become separated from the products of their labor the labor process, their own human nature, and from each other, which results in the dehumanization of work. This dehumanization, says Marx, occurs when the means of production, that is, the physical, non-human tools such as factories, technology, and raw materials, are owned by the capitalists and not the workers. Second, Marx believed that reality was shaped by dialectical materialism. This was Marx's application of the Hegelian dialectic to the material world, where inequalities or inequities in the material condition lead to change and progress through conflict and resolution. This dialectical materialism formed Marx's concept of the social democracy, which, unlike a classical democracy in the United States, is a form of democracy where the state would eventually wither away, leading to a classless, stateless society, aka communism. Marx's concept then of social democracy was more of a transitional phase from capitalism to communism. Marx's social democracy can only be achieved through a proletariat revolution, an overthrow of the capitalist system leading to the establishment of a classless society. This revolution also needs to overthrow what Marx called the capitalist false consciousness of meta-narratives. The belief in absolute truth or intrinsic moral good was, for Marx, a capitalist invention used to mask the true nature of class relations, leading the working class to accept their exploitation as natural or inevitable. Once the oppressed are dissuaded of their false consciousness, then the social democracy could be organized by the proletariat through workers' councils, unions, community organizers, or simple structures. Marx's new social democracy also embraced the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is his belief that there must be a transitional state where the proletariat hold political power to oppress the bourgeois and dismantle capitalist structures, paving the way for communism. Communism, therefore, is the end goal of the proletariat movement, where class distinctions, along with the state, will wither away, leading to a society where the means of production are communally owned and distribution is based on need. Again, that famous phrase, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So with that background, let's bring in Leroy and George to the conversation. So welcome, Leroy and George. I'm looking forward to this conversation. We had to delay it last month. We've had some challenges, but it should be pretty great to go through this book. George, since you're kind of new, you haven't been on the show with us before, would you do us the honor, introduce yourself a little bit, tell folks who you are, and maybe also a little bit of your interest in this particular work, where you came to it from, or what drove you to say yes to do this episode with us?
Well, I said yes because you're a nice guy. That's the first part.
Oh, thanks.
I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe. I'm a philosopher theologian there, and do some research, write some various books. Just had a recent book published called Revealing God in Science. And I also run what we call our scholar community, which is close to around 300 mainly STEM scholars, though we have philosophers, theologians, and lawyers and others. But we equip them, support them to help have science-faith conversations in the marketplace where they are in their business or in the university, wherever they find themselves. So that's the one part that I do. I've been doing that with that organization, Reasons to Believe, for about 5 years. But I'm also a senior adjunct philosophy professor at Azusa Pacific University here in Southern California. I've taught there since 2002. And everything from intro to philosophy to ethics, applied ethics. I do some specialization in ethics and data analytics, big data, AI, and some other fun things. So I've done that for quite some time. And just to let you know, I was a pastor for over 20 years locally here in Southern California, both an associate and a lead pastor. So I'm just not an academic. I live and breathe with other people and what happens in their lives. So philosophy is very much the love of wisdom and trying to live a flourishing life. So that's a quick summary.
That's awesome, man. Well, I'm glad you can join us. I'm sure you're going to bring a lot of richness to this. Leroy, I do have to ask, man. Anything exciting going on in your life? Anything you want to update us on before we jump into the big stuff? So anything good for
No,
us? You always
nothing
say
new.
no. I still ask you every time anyway, so I don't know how that works,
Nothing
but
new.
you always say that. But anyway, so all right, well, let's jump in then. Let's look at our first of six worldview questions, which is how did I come into being? Now, what's interesting, I think, one of the reasons I was excited about this is really the first philosopher book that we've covered that actually we don't have to speculate as much. Like with Rousseau and Hobbes, we had to speculate a little bit, and we ended up compressing the how did I come into being and what happens when I die. Kind of compress that into one thing because they don't really answer those. They're books that we surveyed were really just political theory with some worldview stuff in the background that shaped their ideas, but they didn't weren't explicit about a lot of their ideas. But with Marx and Engels, we have both the political theory, but it's tied really to a worldview perspective of atheistic materialism. So they're much more explicit about that. So in a sense, this is really more a full orbed worldview compared to the other ones, at least in terms of the writings that we were examining for those other writers. So that's kind of interesting. So let me jump into this human origin stuff. I'll just give you some of what I came up with, guys, and then I'll throw it to you for what you see, the response to what I say, or what you want to add to this. So Marx and Engels really were shaped by evolutionary thoughts, Darwinian evolutionary ideas, but they differed too. So for Engels, what I found this was really interesting. This is why I want to throw this one in. Engels believed our first bipedal ancestors sprang from an ape species that was all covered in hair, had pointy ears, and lived on the sunken continent of Lemuria. But the key difference, really, aside from that little bit of history, between Darwin and Engels was that Engels saw labor and social organization as stronger evolutionary forces than biology. I kind of went outside of our thing a little bit and ended up reading an essay by Engels called The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man. He wrote this: by the combined functioning of hand, speech, organs, and brain, not only in each individual, but also in society, men became capable of executing more and more complicated operations, were able to set themselves and achieve higher and higher aims. The work of each generation itself became different, more perfect, and more diversified. When I was trying to digest this, I ended up trying to look at some Marxist scholars that are contemporary scholars. And the best summary I've got in my head, and you guys can tell me where you think about this, if it fits in with what your understanding is. In short, Engels really believed that the bourgeois evolutionists, that what we would see as more the traditional Darwinists, these bourgeois evolutionists were fixated on the mind of the elites as the drivers of civilization. But those committed to the Marxist worldview really believed that the real driver of human evolution was labor for the benefit of community, as opposed to, say, the more enlightenment view of the mind. So anyway, what are your thoughts on that, about human origins? Anything, does that resonate with where you guys see? Am I missing the mark, or what do you got to add to that?
Real quickly, it's interesting that Marx corresponded with Darwin, and he took a big liking to Darwin, but I guess it wasn't very reciprocal. Darwin didn't take much notice of Marx, and I wonder, I don't know if it's written anywhere, if that kind of bugged him, given his nature.
Mm.
But the one thing that we can explore later, I imagine, but it's interesting because Marx, to me, in my reading of him and reading other scholars who are Marx scholars, it's interesting because he seems to have an idea of human nature that needs to be realized in some sense. So it's not always just a completely random process. It's almost as if he sneaks in some of Aristotle's telos, a teleological part of human nature, though it's not always explicit. I think that's a part of his view. It may not have been as much of Engels's view, but it seemed to me to be a part of Marx, because he does talk about that realization and even kind of promoting a type of human flourishing.
Leroy, what do you think, man?
Well, starting points matter, right? Marx and Engels' starting point. It matters, and they start, as you said, in a from a Darwinian perspective. Even if Darwin, didn't accept Marx's, perspective, or but they start there, and that starting point is problematic. It imports this concept of oughts. It imports a concept of a telos, but where does it come from, right? What's the found and what's the foundation and root of it? Those are the questions that when you begin to peel down Marx and Engels, you see that it's arbitrary. I mean, they're really arbitrary. I mean, they don't work on a purely Darwinian perspective. They're really arbitrary if you take them at their word.
Yeah, and it seems like one of those arbitrary factors is just the value would be one on a positive sense, the need of community. So community seems to be the ultimate value that drives stuff, but also an anti-Western, anti-industrialist thing. I was thinking back to our episode that we did on Rousseau, and there's this contrast, right? Rousseau idealized the noble savage of the past, but Marx and Engels idealized the noble communist of the future. And so they both saw this ideal condition of man as free from institutions of Western society that would allow just this raw engagement between one-on-one with no hindrances of structure or societal controls at all. So they seem to have the same view of man, but Rousseau put it in the past and the Marxists put it in the future. Yeah, and George, something else you mentioned too with what you saw about true of human nature. It's definitely not fixed, and it's always changing. I resonate with that as well, but it's in relationship to our labor. Like labor seems to be the key factor there. We're entirely material beings because there's no God. Mm-hmm. So we have material desires, possessions, production, differences define in total that like who we are, right? All these differences in the material. So it seemed to me, and this is sort of like was just these little moments that I was trying to put. It seemed like then even children then were merely the product of a marriage to exist only to serve some material need. So even the concept of children and family becomes a materialist process that serve the community, which sort of seems a little dehumanizing in some sense, or depersonalizing of that parent-child relationship.
He wrote a little, I don't know if it was a booklet or whatever, called The Holy Family, and tried to describe some of that. It seems to me, and from what I read from Marxian scholars, that he thinks human nature does have some universal qualities and qualities that change. And this is what's somewhat, you could argue, inconsistent with his overall materialism. And so if human beings have certain qualities and they're shared by other human beings, that starts to sound a little bit like, and I don't want to use too technical terms, but it sounds like the idealism that he rejects ultimately, at least certain types of Hegelian idealism. And so some scholars talk about that he has a thin view of human nature, not a thick view of human nature, in that it's not necessarily consistent with his materialism throughout his writings and his development.
Do you think that's because he can't escape he can't escape the power of the language and importing the ideas? He's got to, in the ideas that he's utilizing, he's got to import concepts in that he may not like, but he still has to speak to people who argue or who agree, with that perspective. So he's got to import those ideas, and even though he himself may, disagree with them, because he's still got to appeal to people in his arguments.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's interesting. People paint him as a revolutionary, and that's fine. But he was trained as a philosopher. And so I think he understood some of the philosophy behind these things and knew he had to address it and to deal with it. But at the same time, he's obviously going after the comment. Well, we talked about this before in your introduction. A working class people who may not know all those ideas. So when you read the Communist Manifesto, it's actually, I would be curious on your guys' thoughts on this. It's actually not a too difficult of a read. It's kind of down to earth. He's talking about, the alienation between the classes. And I think people could, one of the reasons it's popular, I think people could identify with some of the alienation or separation that he's bringing out. He seems, at least in that writing, seems accessible to me by a broad group of people. Whereas if you read Hegel, or he was influenced by Feuerbach and others, not necessarily the same kind of easy reading unless you're a specialist.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I do think he simplifies a lot of philosophy into, hey, bad stuff happens to you. Who can you blame for that? And why not blame the guy that has a lot of stuff that you want? So a lot of it seems to be based on, if I would go down to Christian worldview, just on simple greed and the need. I want what that guy has. There's a reason I don't have what that guy has. Honestly, I think Marx kind of had this whole idea in mind. I think he kind of reminds me of the middle child who doesn't see any flaws in himself and it's everybody else's fault. And to be honest, it seems like he invented an entire philosophy just to blame other people for his life's problems, because he was terrible with money. He had problems personally and with, having affairs and kids, and, that he didn't take care of, at least one kid, not kids, plural. But it just seems like he's the middle child philosopher who's trying to come up with a reason why it's not his fault.
Yeah, and I want to hear Leroy's thought on this. On the Christian view, it seems like to me the problem is me, or it's an inner problem and my relationship with God. But for him, the problem is out there, and that's a completely different shift. Now, while the Christian worldview can incorporate that there's a problem out there, that stems from the problem in here. And I think you're right, Joe. He wants to project it all out there. Out there is the problem. That particular system, maybe that person's greed or envy, whatever vices you want to put out there. Again, there you go with what Leroy said, importing certain kinds of language. And something I hope we could bring up a little bit later is his view of morality, because he has to import these terms. They do not really fit with his worldview, and he almost tries to stay away from these moral categories, even though he knows he can't completely do it. But he wants his view of communism to really transcend categories of morality and justice and these kinds of things. But we can talk about that more later.
I was going to say, I think that is the key point. I was up last night and just on ChatGPT, just doing ChatGPT stuff.
That's where Leroy does all his deep research on ChatGPT.
No, it isn't. But this was really valuable. So I saw Owen Anderson. I saw Dr. Anderson had released a Substack where he was debating Marx, and I was like, debating Marx on ChatGPT. So I said, okay, let's put Marx and Engels in ChatGPT. And I said, ChatGPT, why don't you play the role of Marx and Engels? And I want to debate with you. And as we went on for like 35 minutes, I realized right away that Marx is importing, and this is, he's importing these ideas that he doesn't hold to. I mean, he has to speak in terms of morality, even though he himself doesn't agree with morality, because he's got an appeal to an audience. And then when I realized how much of his argumentation rests on a Christian worldview, the truthfulness of a Christian worldview, and a worldview that he doesn't support or hold himself, you realize that it is really built on a house of cards. I mean, we were talking about why it's so simple, because Marx's view is built on resentment. This is something I think Derrida really, picks up, is the concept of resentment. Someone owes you something. Somebody has more than you. And doesn't that, this kind of jibes with Marx's whole mentality. Doesn't it make you feel like a failure? How can I be so smart and have all this wisdom and then be in so much lack? Somebody is holding something out on you. And that has a very deep appeal for people who don't think too deeply,
Yeah.
who want to believe they're victims.
Yeah, and those are great summaries of ideas. I think where we get started, it kind of leads into this our next worldview question: how can I know the purpose for my life? And my take on this is that this idea of dialectical materialism is really this path of knowledge. So, according to Marx and Engels, it's the scientific study of history to discern laws and then apply those laws to our context to refine and perfect our labor. So in Engels' eulogy to Karl Marx, this was in London on March 17th, 1883, here's what he said. Just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history. The simple fact hitherto concealed by an outgrowth of ideology. Again, what you guys were saying before, he rejected this sort of ideological thing, even though he imports some of it. Anyway, so it's concealed by this focus on ideology. But what he says, what Marx then discovers, is that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue political science, art, or religion. And so something I picked up on the way, I was trying to listen to some Marxist scholars, and there was a conference. I can't remember which one it was. It's not really important. A lot of them said very similar things, but something along these lines. It said, to know our purpose is a fool's errand of the bourgeois to try to study the history of ideas. What we need to study is the history of labor. And that seemed to summarize pretty well, I think, that idea of how do we know? Well, we study labor. We study history of labor, not ideas. Ideas are bad, which seems to be a little bit ironic since this whole writing is about ideas. So I don't know, it seems to collapse in on itself there. But what are your thoughts then about that way of knowing?
Something that I do when I do teach introduction to philosophy and we get into worldview, naturalism is a broad, basic worldview. And it seems to me that Marx is hyper-focusing, or at least just focusing on a particular kind or developing a new kind of naturalism. And we could distinguish between different kinds of naturalism. So we're probably familiar with scientific or what's called metaphysical naturalism, where it focuses in on science as the way to know. Purpose is education and knowing the world around us and its processes. There is a little bit of reaction to that from a humanistic naturalist perspective, where the focus is not on reduction in the atoms of this world, but it's back on human beings as the center and investigation for life. And I think Marx picks up on that. And whereas existential atheists focused on the alienation from God and from having meaning, purpose, and value in life, leading to a nihilism, Marx, you're right, emphasizes, and he focuses in on it, what I would call a horizontal alienation between other human beings, specifically economic alienation. So I think we can distinguish between different kinds of naturalism or materialism, and Marx is developing or promoting a very specific kind.
Yeah, I think the goal for Marx is to root his, because he's not really arguing for a moral framework in the sense that you and I would be arguing for a moral framework. He wants to root it in the concept of labor, because the concept of labor, everybody can understand it. We talked about, how simple, his philosophy is. Everybody can understand labor. Everybody can understand the suffering that is involved in labor, that someone has more than you. And he wants to root it in the universality of the suffering and the experience that everyone has with labor, because that's going to be the engine by which he's going to import his moral ideas through. He wants to talk about alienation that comes from between the bourgeois and the proletariat. Yeah,
Proletarian.
he wants to talk about that alienation, but the only way that he can actually make this case to the common man in this simple argument is to say, this suffering is rooted because somebody's doing something to you. Somebody is taking something from you. Somebody is not allowing you to actualize in the way that they are, and that is a problem. So it doesn't have to be super complicated in the sense of to talk about the meaninglessness of life, or from a humanistic standpoint. He just really wants to say, I don't have to really explain this too deeply to you. You experience this, every day. You experience this in every single facet of your work life, and that's the dominant deal.
Yeah, one of the things too that might be interesting to bring up is this when it comes to purpose, on the purpose of the family, because I think today you see a lot of socialist, communist ideas. The idea that the family unit, the nuclear family, is sort of the bad thing that's harming us, and it's not clear to me where that line from Marx, Engels to where we are today with that. It doesn't seem like there's a real direct line there, because I'm not sure exactly. But there was this quote that I came across that was interesting. This was Marx on family and women. He said this: bourgeois marriage. So the marriage is between the capitalists, right? The wealthy, and he's proletariat. He's like, he's concerned about this whole thing. He's like, so this bourgeois marriage is really a system of wives in common. And thus, at the most, what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce a substitute for a hypocritical, concealed, or openly legalized community of women. So his whole idea was that they want to do away with traditional marriage structures. But he's like, well, if you think we're in our communal marriage concept, is that so bad? Well, all the bourgeois live that way anyway. So they have wives, and then they have concubines, essentially, and mistresses, and they're just passing around women all the time. They just do it in a different way. The kind of ironies I saw is that he assumes there's this class identity. If you're bourgeois, all bourgeois marriage is like that. If you're not the proletariat, every marriage is like that, of every wealthy person. So this sort of classist identity. So I don't know. What do you think about what did they do? What was their view of marriage and the purpose of relationship and childbearing? Do they have a clear thing in their writings, or is it more just the way it pans out? Everyone kind of fills in what they think they wanted to say.
One thing I wanted to point out, and you guys probably do this in your teaching or classes, or that when I teach in the honors college and we're focusing on a primary text, I always have to do it, coach myself too, is say, what is this person saying in this text? What are they really saying? And it's interesting. I think when you read the Communist Manifesto, there are some passages that Marx describes things, I think, that resonates with people. Now, his solutions, are something different. But I think there's passages that resonate, and you were pointing to some there, Joe. And here's another one when he talks about the family, and you can almost hear people today saying something similar, just replace some of the words. But he says, quote, the bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. End of quote. And so I could see Christians resonating with that. If you just change out the bourgeoisie and put some other label in there, you could say, yeah, the sentimental veil of the family has torn away, and we treat family relations as mere contracts, or exchange for money. When my parent dies, I hope they leave X, Y, or Z in their trust or will for me. And those are money transactions. I could see people complaining about that, but the key is well, you might identify the problem, but what is a solution to that? I think from the Christian perspective, is going to be a different kind of solution.
Yeah, but I love the fact that you point out that he identifies the problem. He's very good at identifying the problem because I think that suits his overall purpose, which is to undermine capitalism, undermine every aspect of norms within a given society. I was reading Carl Trueman's "To Change All Worlds," and Carl Trueman makes the case that the Marxist doesn't see, or at least Marx didn't see, human nature as being static. And he also argues that because Marx's goal is to critique and criticize capitalism, it's to criticize all norms. And one of those norms is marriage and family relationships. And he does that for the purpose of pointing out that, in a capitalist system, this is just all about money. It's reductionist. It's all about the powerful staying rich and powerful and having these institutions that serve their needs. And it's almost and this is, I think, the one thing that I did walk away from it, that it's just a withering critique of every aspect of presuppositions and norms in capitalist society. And he doesn't have to suggest a solution, because that's not his goal. His goal is deconstruction. His goal is the destruction of that system. So he just wants to point out in every facet where that system is failing. And then, it appeals to, the experiences that we have. I think our discussion is going to move in a little bit toward why Christians track with it. Mm-hmm. Well, I think you pointed out a clear reason that he's critiquing experiences that people have on an everyday basis, and now he's painting those experiences in a deleterious fashion, for the goal of making them known so that they can be changed.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, in that you see some decent analysis of the problem, but the solution often, even if it's clear or not, sometimes it's not. But when it is clear, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right solution, right? So you can get a diagnosis and two doctors can say, yeah, you've got cancer, but they can give you different pathways to healing. And one might have a great one and one might have a ridiculous one. That doesn't, just because they can both analyze the problem doesn't mean that they can give an equally valuable solution. And I think that's why there's this appeal, even amongst Christians. I think I sent you guys, I'm fascinated by Karl Barth, obviously, in his early life as a Christian theologian. And, of course, he changed, but he was enamored with this sort of socialist communist ideal, especially early on. He seems to have moved away from some of that later. But in 1911, he writes this essay, Jesus Christ and the Movement for Social Justice. And in this, he says the following: to be a socialist means to be a comrade in consumers' unions, in labor unions, in political parties. He ceases to be an individualist, to be something for himself. He takes seriously that the Swiss saying, quote, one for all and all for one. As a socialist, he no longer thinks and feels and acts as a private person, but rather as a member of a forward-striding, fighting totality. Solidarity is the law and the gospel of socialism. Or to speak once again with Joseph Deitzigen, I'm not saying his name right, a conscious and planned organization of social work is what the longed-for savior of the modern period is called. And so you see him where he takes even Christian ideas of community and family and not just being an individual, which are good. Individualism as a whole is not aligned well with Christianity, but he sees that as a parallel to communism or socialism and says, aha, so Marx Engels are giving this great solution that aligns with Christianity. The gospel of Jesus is a gospel of socialism and social justice. That's where he kind of lands in that. And I think it's easy to see why that deception is so powerful even amongst Christians. There's a quote we have from one of our viewers here, and I think I can pop it up here. On Facebook, Bogo David says, what do Marxism and Christianity have in common? or its philosophical ideals contradicts in totality the biblical teaching. And I think that's what I was just kind of driving at. I think that's what you're going to answer. That's why I wanted to throw that's the question coming up. So now pick up, Leroy.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Marx's plan to not offer a solution is somewhat genius, because that leaves room for later Marxists to apply his overall project to their situation and find solutions that are within that particular structure. So take Karl Barth, who you just raised. I mean, one of the big questions that you're going to, if you listen to young people today, one of the big issues is, the so-called concept of rugged individualism that is, rooted within the capitalist, system. They would say, well, when they read the overall structure of Christianity, they see Christianity rooted in community. And for them, I mean, this is a blow against a thoroughly capitalist society. And we should be more collectivist in our approach. And even though that may be just a small inroad, I mean, for them in their instincts, it seems like this gives us more of the collectivist idea or ideal that we see within Christianity. I had a friend of mine, several years ago, make this very case that, the concept of rugged individualism that we see undergirded throughout American society, he thought was destructive to Christianity, and saw that a Marxist perspective seemingly fitted better. I mean, even if the underlying assumptions were hostile to Christianity.
Yeah, that kind of leads into really that next worldview question. What's the right thing to do, right? This gets to George earlier, we talked about the moral underpinnings and where does that morally take us. Weicker says in his book, the Communist Manifesto is not merely a political philosophy, it's a call to action. That's that question, what's it calling us to? Well, really to establish this sort of social democracy, distinct from maybe a traditional democracy, and that this sort of classless, purely egalitarian society. That's the ultimate sort of impetus of it. Where I see this struggle today is that, for example, we hear this terminology of woke right that's out. I'm not a fan of that terminology. I know a lot of smart thinkers are doing that. But one of the problems, I think it does something superficial in that it takes, somebody on, this political view is sharing an idea. That idea also, Marx said that thing. Therefore, they must be pulling on Marx to make their thinking, right? They're just on the right instead of on the left. But I think that's kind of a superficial analysis. At least that's my take, because Marx did, just making these gross sort of observations about challenges doesn't mean one is a Marxist because you agree with the analysis of the problem. So, for example, what was really interesting is when I was reading the Communist Manifesto, and he's talking about the oppressor, oppressed, and all of these sort of who's to blame and the abuse of power, right? So he makes a lot of observations about the abuse of power. So I could read something, I could take a Communist Manifesto, change some language, and read it about the abuse of power and say, I agree with that. And say, well, you agree with Marx, that makes you a communist. Well, no, because he made some good observations. So it brought to mind actually this passage from Federalist Paper 65, and Alexander Hamilton. And he's talking about the impeachment process, which is very timely, the last bunch of years. And here's what he said. A well-constituted court for the trial of impeachment is an object not more to be desired than difficult to be obtained in a government wholly elective. So it's harder to do than it is to talk about, right? It's like putting it out there is easy. Doing it, he says, is really hard. He says the subjects of this jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may, with peculiar propriety, be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. The prosecution of these improprieties, these political malfeasance, right? He says, for this reason, will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community and to divide into parties, more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. In other words, he's saying, so it depends how you perceive it. Is he on my side or their side, right? He said these offenses are going to end up polarizing us into political partisanship. Here's the sort of the rub here. He says, in many cases, it will connect itself with the pre-existing factions and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influences, and interests on the one side or the other. And in such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstration of innocence or guilt. And so, when you read the Communist Manifesto, it's like, hey, it's a class struggle for them, the bourgeois versus the proletariat, and everybody's seeing it from their class identity. Right and wrong is determined by class identity. And he's right that power imbalance can be abused and people are doing it. So he's not wrong in that sense as far as Marx goes, because everybody observed that. But Alexander Hamilton wasn't a communist because he observed that power imbalance exists and people will divide into factions because of that. There's something deeper he's arguing for in terms of what makes moral right and wrong. And that's kind of the question I want to frame all that to say is, how is he actually framing moral right and wrong in his view? And what would make that difference than just simply observing power imbalance and injustice?
Yeah, I would just simply say it's the goal. The Marxist wants to raise these issues, these problems, so to speak, to say that and point out that the problem is with capitalism. You were talking about the woke right? I think in some ways the woke right title is 100% correct, and here's why. And I think for the same reason, the woke right wants to use the methodology of the critical theorists, the people that they capitalize. And they want to utilize that against them. They want to use the same kinds of critiques, only they want to use the critiques in a different direction. But they have a different goal than the woke left. They want to capitalize on the disaffected. One of the things that really shocked me in looking at them was the same methodology, the same tactics, the same goal. Whereas the one is pointed at the disaffected minorities, the other one is pointing at disaffected whites, and both are using the same rhetorical language to the same rhetorical effect. Now let's look at the distinction between Hamilton and Marx. Hamilton they're both pointing at the problem, but they're doing so for different reasons. They both have different goals. Hamilton wants to prevent factionism, right? His goal is to prevent factionism and try to say that, if we have to have this process, then we need to all be reasonable, because the goal is the flourishing of our country and our body politic, so to speak. Whereas Marx wants to surface those for the purpose of saying that capitalism is wrong. We need to have something else. Let's point this thing out. Let's critique these presuppositions. Let's critique these issues so that we can, put something else in its place. So they have different, even though they might be criticized, they have different goals and different, a whole different plan, so to speak.
Couple of quick thoughts to make. And I don't know if I'm disagreeing with Leroy, but I think,
well, that would probably make you right. So Marx, I hope you are.
I'd be interesting to get his response. Marx doesn't make the claim that capitalism is wholly and objectively unjust, because he actually wants to transcend those categories. And he actually had some appreciation for what it produced. So he wasn't against the technology and the commodities that are produced. He thinks they're being used in ways that doesn't produce a communist or a communal ideal. And so the way I would put it is, Marx thought that capitalism wasn't the best way for human beings to live. And so it must be transcended. We have to go on to the next step. Whether you say that's socialism and then communism, I think he has a real internal struggle, knowing that on a materialist view, it's really, really hard to know what morality is or to justify it. And I think he wants to transcend those categories. And if you read Das Kapital, morality and justice, injustice doesn't have a lot to play in there. It's how you arrange the society to have self-realization and some kind of human flourishing on his view, or their view. So I think there's some nuances to bring into it. I think I might be a little uncomfortable. I don't think in the text he just comes out and says objectively capitalism is wrong. It's the wrong way.
I disagree. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
So do you disagree or agree? What do you think, Leroy? Come back at him. Go with George.
No,
Hit him hard.
I think that's an accurate. I think that's an accurate reading. As you were thinking, I'm thinking more. Marx's children, his intellectual children. Probably that's kind of where I'm thinking of it in those terms. So
yeah, there is a great difference between what Marx and Engels write in the Communist Manifesto as compared to how Marxists and others develop their thoughts. And there's this old phrase that says, "We're all undone by our disciples." And I would agree, it's been taken in different directions. And there's kind of some scholars call it a romantic critique of capitalism that says, really technology is what's bad and commodities are bad. And I don't think that that's really Marx's view, at least from the text. I don't think that's his view. He wants all that, but he thinks the means of capitalism is just wrong. It won't promote the kind of community, idealist community that he's thinking of.
Yeah, so there's two directions I want to go with this, and this is one direction in terms of the modern context. And so let's focus on the Christian side for a second. Again, I'm going to go back to Barth a little bit here. He summarizes that idea of social democracy this way. We must eliminate private property to transform private capitalism into social capitalism. He says, I have spoken about what socialists want, not about the manner in which they attain it, about what they want. I say that is what Jesus wanted too. About the manner in which they act to attain it, I could not say the same thing. So he was seeing that Jesus' goal was the same goal as what Marx had in terms of the socialist ideal. Are those goals the same? And is that what makes Christians really kind of gravitate in some of these cases towards communism, socialism?
I don't think so. I think that the sentiment is what is what is more forward in the discussion than the principle or the truthfulness of the ideas that undergird it. I think the sentiment for unity, togetherness, and to divorce ourselves from the negative aspects of living in a capitalist society. I mean, in a very broad sense, I could see how someone would superficially grab onto those ideas and say, hey, we're tracking in the same way, but the goal is far different. Galatians 3:28, there's no Jew or Greek. He's not removing class from the discussion. That's not what he's doing there. He's saying that in God we're all equal. Not one is better than the other. Whereas I think Marx wants to utilize class, the distinction between the two to draw out ideas about resentment and to force change or revolution.
George, what do you got for us on that? What do you think about that relationship? Was Marx borrowing from Paul essentially, and is a guy like Barth, right, correct that in essence, the communist vision of the future is Jesus' vision of the future? They just have different means of achieving that same end. Is that correct?
The Bible and Paul's view, I would use the term biblical realism. Paul sits within a tradition of Judaism that goes a long way back, and I would say is a thick worldview, not a thin worldview. And Marx has a way of reducing things, as we've already said, to more of an economic problem. So he identifies some good problems. We might even have some common ground with identifying problems that are there. But I came upon this quippy phrase that I think kind of sums part of this up. If our greatest need had been technology, God would have sent a scientist. If our greatest need was money, God would have sent an economist. And if our greatest need had been pleasure, God would have sent an entertainer. But our greatest need was forgiveness, so he sent a savior. Marx wants to reduce it down. Our greatest need is self-realization, to displace or remove this alienation that we feel. And that's too thin of a worldview. And he's too optimistic about human nature's ability to accomplish those ends.
That's good. I think that idea of a thin versus thick, I think there's this tendency where we pick, so this happens in Genesis and ancient Near East civilizations, and we take these myths of the origins and we say, oh, this one talks about humans and the clay, and the Genesis talks about God forming out of the dust, and therefore these stories are the same or they're connected. But we take these, in philosophical terms, accidental properties, or we take these sort of superficial elements, and then we try to say, we're telling the same story. And so there's this tendency, I think, this reductionist tendency in terms of ancient Near East mythologies and civilizations. I think that's, on a political philosophy sense, the same thing that's within our nature to do, is we're very reductionistic. And I think that's what I hear you both saying, is that we are connecting on some level. And I agree. I don't think Marx was channeling Paul in any meaningful way, but influenced by Western civilization as we were. He's living in England, and which is a Judeo-Christian society, a Christian society in that sense, influenced by those ideas. I think he was in some ways swimming in that water with this ideal being out there. He just doesn't see it as deeply as the Bible sees it, with the challenges of sin, with all those, so the solution being, like you said, George, with a savior. And so he's seeing it as a purely superficial, materialistic sense. So I don't even really think they share the same goals as Barth. I would say Bart. I can never get it right. So sorry to all the Bart fans or Barth fans, whatever you want to call yourselves. But I don't think his assessment was right. I don't think Jesus' goal was Marx's goal. I don't think they had the same goal at all in mind. And so I think that's a little bit misleading in that sense. Well, when it comes to this moral side of the outworking of it, I think there's a lot of ways. Again, I think you said earlier, George, it might have been Leroy, but talking about the sort of a philosophy played out in the life of the disciples. What does that look like? That can undo a lot of things. And I think when I see this living out today, there's a consistency of the last 100+ years where the killing of people who are considered the oppressor group, those who are not allowing us to achieve our ideal, is acceptable, right? That does blend within. There has to be this destabilizing period of oppression and control. That's clearly a part of the pathway to this ideal of the class of society. And we do definitely see this. And I was struck recently with the head of that healthcare agency in New York when he was shot. And this is sort of the response from many on the left was, well, yeah, that's kind of bad, but not really, because those are the people that are taking advantage. I mean, when people can't get the right healthcare, these people are at fault. So there wasn't this sort of outrage or anger at somebody getting shot in cold blood in the back, because there was a class distinction there that is being undone by this act of violence. I want to show you guys this clip. I don't know if you've seen this. This was a gal on, I believe it was originally TikTok. I came across this on X. But check this out, and then I want to get your response to this in terms of this living out our purpose and the Marxist, Marx Engels sort of ethic.
I don't know about y'all, but today I feel so reinvigorated. Class consciousness is on the rise today. I haven't had hope like this in a long time. Here's the thing. They are so good at keeping us divided because people who are divided are easier to control. So they manufacture all these differences between us to make us hate each other and fight with each other so that we don't realize our collective fight is actually against the elites, that it's a class war that we're actually in the midst of, the working class against the elite. Based off all the videos I'm seeing, based off the comment sections, based off the general consensus as a united front, we all feel the same. We all feel the same, and we're all agreeing. Do you know how hard it is to get the American people to come together and agree on something? God, imagine if we put our powers together to actually fight against our real enemy. I have hope today. Maybe it's naive, but I have hope.
Now, again, that was her response to this guy being shot in the back.
Well, let me just add a little bit of data. I was taken aback by, I think it came from the Emerson College polling. It was published in a number of places, but I think well, let me read it here. 68% of voters overall reject the killer's actions. Younger voters, and I'm using their words, I'm not importing words here. Younger voters and Democrats are more split. 41% of voters aged 18 to 29 find the killer's actions acceptable, and 24% somewhat acceptable, and 17% completely acceptable, while 40% of them unacceptable. And then if you go down further, this compares to 12% of others, including Republicans, and 16% of independents who find the actions acceptable. And it underscores, they write, the shifting social attitudes among the younger electorate when it comes to what are the mechanisms we can use to change society. Those are some concerning numbers about the means of accomplishing what you think is good. And it comes across as a dark utilitarianism to me, that we can use these means to accomplish the greater good. And that seems very troubling in my mind.
The lack of self-awareness about the horror that they are foisting on society is disturbing, but it's becoming more and more normal. Young people in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, they're killing each other without a concern for human life, and I think you are seeing it, that drive, or that lack of a concern for human life, is not merely manifested in some neighborhoods. It's almost, universal. This person, the girl that we just saw, she's probably an educated young lady. I mean, she's probably, very smart, but if you listen to what her passions are and her desires for economic freedom, to no longer be a victim or to be, oppressed, and to throw off the change, even if that means shooting a man in the back who's technically done nothing to you. It's frightening.
Yeah. I think we see this, Marxist, socialist, communist. I'm just kind of rolling all those things into one idea, Marx, Engels, all that kind of. But we see these things playing out in the culture. We see it amongst Christians in some way. We see it in just her sheer joy at the death of this guy who she sees as the oppressor, right? The bourgeois who has held down the proletariat that is oppressed. And if we can just unite, workers of the world unite, kind of thing, right? You hear this language embedded in what she's talking about, and how they want to divide us. Well, we're uniting around these same goals of shared life and future. It's just a striking reflection, I think, of what I read in these things. And it's also, the numbers, especially you gave, George, very concerning when you think about the percentages of people who will accept that and will think that that's okay. Let's do this then for the sake of time. But the question I want to close with us then is really this. Where is there a gospel opportunity in all this? How do we create an opportunity for the gospel when we are confronted with, clips like we saw this girl have, or even other Christians who are just sort of enamored with socialism in general and see that's what Paul taught, or that's what Jesus was teaching anyway. Where do you see the inroad for the gospel in the midst of this? How do we engage this? I'll start with you, George, and then we'll close with you, Leroy.
I like the phrase, it's not original with me, but to seek clarity over agreement first. Let's get clear on what we're talking about, and then we can try to persuade one another. I think when we're talking about Marxism, or Marx specifically, Marx actually thought that work kind of was good, and that he just wanted the leisure time and the resources to do to fulfill the desires and things that he saw. Right now, the Christian can also come along and clearly say that God has created originally work to be good. Then it's sacred, actually. And so, yes, there's the problem of the fall, but how do we redeem work? And there's a number of contemporary authors, from the New Testament writer Ben Witherington to the late Tim Keller, who wrote about work. And there's lots of ways that we can say, I agree, work is a good thing, and we want to be fulfilled in doing that. And that could be a common ground that someone who is a Marxist or is reading Marx, we could build from. But like you guys mentioned earlier, what happens very quickly is you see that they're building out from very different worldviews. And there we can start to see the differences between the sacredness of work under a Judeo-Christian view and how it plays out in a Marxist view. In a Marxist view, I think it leads to some of the evils that not only we can see in history, but some we've seen in our own few days. I was in Romania in 1991, right after the communist wall fell. And I experienced in most of Eastern Europe the effects and implications of trying to live out certain socialist and Marxist ideas. And it was not pretty. But students today, the ones I encounter, even graduate students, they have no knowledge of this, and they're getting their information like you showed on that clip. If I only saw it once, but where is she getting her data from? Other social media, things like this. It's not always accurate data. I experienced it. I looked into the eyes and went into the homes of the people who lived under it, and they wanted nothing to do with it.
Well, I think George nailed it. We need more reflection. In one sense, we need to divorce ourselves from the wisdom of the day, the spirit of the age that finds anything that any voice on the internet as the true source of wisdom. We kind of need to take a step back and then go back and read our own documents about what we think about these ideas. I mean, as people who are trying to be influencers of the gospel. And then we need to really, I think we need to really address within the church these worldview ideas and get people to start seeing that there's no neutrality. I mean, the world we live in is not neutral. Every economic system is not neutral. They all come with some impediments, and we need to really think about that and really begin to explain that, because I do think the truth is in the church, right? I do think that the church has the truth. And I don't think that we need to be afraid to express that, to say that some things are wrong, to say that some things are right, to say that some ideas, we need to think about that a little bit deeper, and we need to wrestle with those. I just think the time is not to shrink back from society, but it really is to address, the big questions in order to be, to show that, then demonstrate that Christianity is relevant in answering a lot of these questions, and that because people don't think that it is.
What struck me as we were having this conversation is, if I could boil this down without being too reductionist to this distinction, is the Christian worldview would say this: all humans have both intrinsic and instrumental value, right? There's a sacredness to who we are, and instrumentally, we're created by God to do the good works that he had ordained for us. We're to make a good world, and I tell my students, make it gooder, right? There was no flaws, there was no sin, but it was a good world, but it wasn't finished, right? We were to do the labor, if we will, use that sort of sense, that God had ordained us to labor for, right? But that's the instrumental side. But intrinsically, we have the value. Instrumentally, the labor is that value is, are we doing what God has created us to do? For the Marxist, I think they flipped that, actually. I think the intrinsic value is in the labor, and the instrumental value is the humans who do the labor. And so humans become the ones who are expendable or exchangeable, but the labor is what's intrinsically good. And as if we align with the labor, then we're good. If we don't align, then we're bad. And so I think in a sense, maybe they flipped that. Right? So again, the Christian worldview, humans are intrinsically good. The labor is the instrumental good that we do. And what makes it good is, does it align with the holiness of God? And then Marx, they just flip that. So the work is intrinsically good. It's the humans who have to align with the work and the labor. And if we don't, then again, we are of no value. And I think, to me, that seems like there's a gospel opportunity there. Is like, where's the real value? Right, we can observe the problems of power imbalance or oppression and all those sort of things, but what are we really fighting for? Where is the ultimate value found in? And I would say the value for us is found in the human life itself, who is created in the image of God, not the value in the labor, the equalizing of the distribution of wealth or goods. There is so much more that we could say about the Communist Manifesto, but for now, I want to encourage my brothers and sisters to go out, till the soil of culture so that you can raise the roof on the communist agenda and expose your friends and family to the beauty of the Christian story. I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.